turning the page from 192 to 194. 194 to 195 are the key pages in this essay. Let's walk through some of the passages here and see what we can make of them. I'm looking about a quarter of the way down the page on 194, the paragraph that begins, "It is difficult not to see." Now, anytime a paragraph begins by saying it is difficult not to see, yet nevertheless we have a whole paragraph on the topic, it means that it's probably, in truth, pretty difficult to see whatever is at hand. If that weren't the case, we wouldn't need a whole paragraph explaining it to us. In Lacan, this always applies. When he says it is difficult not to see, get ready for the big reveal. It is difficult not to see that even before the advent of psychoanalysis, a dimension that might be called that of the symptom was introduced. Now, this is going to be an important term for what we get into here, this idea of a symptom. Now, at this point in Lacan's career, the idea of the symptom is profoundly connected to his understanding of language, which we're going to talk a little bit about here in a moment. So hold that in mind. He thinks of symptoms here as signifiers. Signifiers. Later on, he will come along and think of symptoms more in terms of another concept, which he calls the synthome. We won't get in much into that here today, but it is quite the opposite of a symptom. It is not something that is interpretable. It's something that defies analysis, that defies interpretation. The synthome is something else entirely. It is not a linguistic or tropological aspect. It is a topological aspect of the subject. But we're not there yet. We're just talking about symptoms. And let's see what we can get going here. This notion of the symptom was introduced, and it was articulated on the basis of the fact that it represents the return of truth as such into the gap of a certain knowledge. Now, I would wager here that the certain knowledge Lacan is talking about here is unconscious knowledge, a certain type of knowledge. And what you'll see in Lacan often is a separation between knowledge and truth. The field of knowledge is the field of consciousness, it's the field of the ego, it's the field of awareness, self-awareness, self-consciousness. Truth, though, for Lacan is usually hooked into the unconscious. It usually finds expression more in the accidental utterance than the one that you consciously, artfully, carefully wrought for an event. So I would suggest that the return of truth that the symptom allows for is a return of unconscious truth, which is a certain type of knowledge if you think about it. You know that there is a lot that you don't know, right? Well, there are a lot of things that you know, but of which you are unaware. Next paragraph. I'm not referring to the classical problem of error. So this is not truth versus error, fact versus mistake. That's not what we're talking about, or truth versus falsehood. Let's see where he goes with this. I'm not referring to the classical problem of error, but rather to a concrete manifestation that must be appreciated clinically, in which we find not a failure of representation, but a truth of another reference than the one, whether representation or not, whose fine order it manages to disturb. So the truth of the unconscious is not one that depends on the logic of representation. And this is interesting. What he's suggesting here is that the symptom doesn't work through a logic of representation. The symptom doesn't represent something else. That's not really what he's about yet. And he wants to suggest that in the history of Western thought, representation has been the dominant logic, and the idea that every expression should connect to a truth or an error in a representative way. So the truth of the unconscious disrupts the logic of representation. This is the fine order that it manages to disrupt, ... in this paragraph. And I would just suggest that the fine order of representation that it manages to disrupt has a certain discourse and discipline attached to it. And that is going to be the discipline of philosophy. The discipline of philosophy is oftentimes figured as the discipline in which truth finds expression, in which representations of truth can be arrived at through philosophical discourse. And that, of course, is premised on the belief that, especially in the modern era, that self-consciousness is the height of philosophical discourse, a kind of awareness. In the old days, it would be kind of like know thyself. By the time, though, we get to the modern era, it's something different. It's about accessing consciousness, self-consciousness, awareness as much as possible. So the completeness that would be at stake here would be a complete self-awareness, a completely cognizant being. And of course, in psychoanalysis, we don't accept that as a possibility. The great discovery of Freud is that we are not complete beings, never completely cognizant, because there's always some part of us that's unconscious. But let's read on here. We could get lost in the next paragraph on 194. There's great stuff out there on Marx as the discoverer of the symptom and the like, but this is not a lecture on Marxism, so let's back off that and move down to the next paragraph. We're on an agenda here. The one that begins, I am aware. I am aware of the precision with which it is fitting to accompany this theme of truth and its detour in knowledge. Now this is important. Bruce has kept the French here for detour because if you look to the right at the bottom of 195, you'll see it again, here worded as a dodge. Keep your eye on this French term. But what Lacan here is saying is that in the discourse of philosophy, truth has been detoured into knowledge. It's the belief that knowledge of oneself, consciousness, self-awareness, he says this is a detour for truth. This is not the true path of truth. This is a detour, a distraction. It's been detoured in knowledge, an arena where truth really has no place. And that's the idea here, is that truth is elsewhere. The field of knowledge has no space in it for truth. And so when truth finds itself there, it is on a detour, which is nevertheless the crux, it seems to me, of philosophy as such. So in this paragraph here, you can see very clearly what Lacan's referring to here. This is psychoanalysis versus philosophy. Psychoanalysis is on the side of truth. Philosophy is on the side of knowledge. Psychoanalysis is on the side of unconscious truth. Philosophy is on the side of egotistical knowledge, especially self-consciousness. There's the unconscious truth that psychoanalysis accesses and brings to our attention. And then there is the obsession with complete and full consciousness, characterized by the ego, that we see driving the discourse of philosophy.